Forget the missiles. Forget the tanks. The blow that will finish off Russia is being dealt in an office in Copenhagen, hidden in the cold lines of an environmental law. Denmark has proven that the ghost shadow fleet Russia established to launder billions of dollars in oil revenues is not only an environmental killer, but also a secret base for drone attacks targeting NATO capitals. With intelligence provided by Denmark, the 18-year-old tanker Boracay, linked to Russia, was seized by French commandos off the coast of Brest last week. It was reported that the ship was believed to have been involved in a recent drone attack on Copenhagen airport. From this moment on, Denmark moved to lock the Baltic Sea to Russian tankers. On October 6th, the Danish government announced that it was tightening environmental and security inspections of oil tankers, especially old and high-risk vessels, passing through its waters or anchored at Skagen Red, an important port between the Baltic and North Seas. However, this goes far beyond a simple security inspection. Danish Industry Minister Morten Bødskov was even more outspoken, saying, "We must put an end to Putin's war machine." This also applies to the Russian shadow fleet. Authorities will now board and inspect ships that cannot be considered to be on a peaceful voyage, including those that are anchored. In other words, this decision allows Danish forces to raid any ship they suspect. This horrific reality uncovered on the Boracay ship and the mounting military tension in the Baltic finally pushed Denmark and its allies to press the button. So, how exactly does this flawlessly designed economic death sentence, this strategic strangulation operation, work on the map and in legal terms? At the heart of this operation lie two critical strongholds in Russia's western geography: St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad. St. Petersburg is Russia's historic capital and its largest commercial gateway to the Baltic. Giant oil terminals such as Primorsk and Ust-Luga are located here, and the heart of Russia's oil exports to Europe beats here. Kaliningrad, on the other hand, is a dagger in the middle of the European Union's territory, with no land connection to the mainland, filled with nuclear weapons and heavily militarized. The Russian Baltic Fleet's main base is located here, and its presence is designed to limit NATO's mobility in the region. However, both of these strongholds are bound by a geographical fate. There is only one narrow corridor through which every ship leaving either of them must pass to reach the Atlantic, the Danish Straits. This waterway, consisting of the Skagerrak and Kattegat, is Russia's economic lifeline and, at the same time, its weakest link. This is precisely the weak link that Denmark is targeting. To fully understand this strategic chokehold operation currently unfolding in the Baltic Sea and why Russia has resorted to such reckless hybrid tactics, we must go back in time and piece together the chain of events. This crisis did not emerge overnight. Its roots stretch back to the most tense days of the Cold War and the most controversial articles of international maritime law. It all began in 1974 with the Helsinki Convention, signed as a measure against the Baltic Sea's increasing industrial pollution. A rare example of cooperation between the Eastern and Western blocs at the time, this agreement aimed to protect the Baltic Sea's ecological balance. The agreement gave the signatory countries, including Denmark, the authority to establish the Baltic Marine Environment Protection Commission, or HELCOM, and to intervene against ships passing through their waters that posed a serious threat to the environment. At the time, this clause was an innocent environmental protection measure intended to be used against an old chemical tanker that was likely to have an accident. No one could have predicted that 50 years later, this clause would become a geopolitical weapon used to strangle the war economy of a superpower. This was the most shocking proof of how law and diplomacy could become deadly weapons. With this move, Putin's last and most important economic lifeline for circumventing Western sanctions is being destroyed not by a missile shield, but by a piece of legislation. The oil taps feeding the Kremlin's war machine have been turned off completely, and this time there is nothing they can do militarily. According to real-time oil market data from financial agencies like Bloomberg, daily oil exports via the Baltic route were generating an average of $250 to $350 million in revenue for Russia. This revenue stream is now being systematically dismantled. This translates to a massive $10 billion monthly black hole or delay in the Russian federal budget. This is a financial heart attack that could paralyze Russia's economic system. Dozens of Russian tankers are now stranded at the entrance to the Danish Straits and in Russian ports. The last lifeline keeping the Russian economy and army afloat has been severed by NATO's ingenious diplomatic and legal trap. So, with a 50-year-old environmental agreement and a shadow fleet operating for 2 years, why did Denmark wait until today to pull the trigger? The answer to this question lies not in an isolated incident, but in a massive strategic chess game involving the planet's greatest military powers, played out in and around the Baltic Sea over the last few months. This was an inevitable consequence of NATO placing the region under an iron dome, forcing Russia into a corner and prompting reckless countermoves. To understand why this move was made now, we must first look at this massive chessboard, namely the overwhelming power balance in the Baltic. The Western Alliance, which turned the Baltic Sea into a strategic NATO lake with the participation of Finland and Sweden, did not leave this doctrine on paper. It backed it up with concrete and formidable military power that would prevent Russia from even breathing. The most frightening symbol of this power was the world's largest warship, the nuclear aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford, and its accompanying strike group, which docked on the British coast in August 2025 and anchored in the North Sea. This 100,000-ton floating fortress, carrying more than 90 F-35 and F/A-18 Super Hornet fighter jets, stood just west of the Danish Straits like a nuclear shield, preventing Russia from embarking on any military adventure. But it was not alone. It was accompanied by the HMS Diamond, a Type 45 destroyer belonging to the British Royal Navy and one of Europe's most advanced air defense ships, and the FGS Hessen, the German Navy's most modern frigate. This deadly trio, supported by NATO Standing Maritime Group 1, effectively trapped the Russian Baltic Fleet in its bases in Kaliningrad, which stands like a dagger in the heart of Europe, and St. Petersburg, Russia's window to the west. This naval force was not merely a defensive line, it was also a vice simultaneously squeezing Russia's two most critical strategic strongholds. The Russian garrison in Kaliningrad was now completely isolated from the mainland, and St. Petersburg's commercial and military lifelines were also being squeezed by this vice. NATO's pressure was not limited to the sea. The skies were also under complete blockade. NATO E-3 Sentry AWACS surveillance aircraft, taking off from bases in Poland and Romania, and RC-135 Rivet Joint Signals Intelligence aircraft, taking off from the UK's Waddington base, listened to Russian communications, scanned radars, and reported even the slightest military movement to headquarters in Brussels 24 hours a day. This electronic blockade left the Russian army blind and deaf. The psychological warfare against the Kremlin was even more ruthless. The training flights over Europe by B-2 Spirit stealth bombers taking off from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, USA, sent a direct message to the Kremlin. If the war escalated, even the most strategic targets in the heart of Moscow would be defenseless. This massive military buildup was suffocating Russia and forcing it to make mistakes in a panic. Indeed, that is what happened. In June 2025, Russia attempted to break this blockade by launching a military exercise with more than 20 warships. However, this amounted to little more than a weak show of force. Then, in September 2025, NATO air radars sounded the alarm repeatedly. On September 22nd, German Eurofighter jets, and on September 25th, Hungarian Gripen jets were forced to intercept Russian Su-30 and MiG-31 fighter jets flying over the Baltic and dangerously approaching civilian flight routes. These were the desperate struggles of a cornered bear. As military provocations increased, the concrete dangers posed by the Shadow Fleet reached a level that could no longer be ignored. According to a shocking report published just this week, on October 5, 2025 by the Danish Defence Intelligence Service, FE, Danish helicopters and ships patrolling the Danish Straits were repeatedly targeted by Russian warships using radar lock. This constitutes an extremely dangerous military provocation, implying that the next step could be firing. The report clearly stated that these actions were a hybrid warfare tactic aimed at applying pressure without crossing the line into armed conflict. This threat perception was not new. In an incident uncovered by Der Spiegel as early as March 2025, German authorities seized a tanker named Aventin, belonging to the Shadow Fleet on suspicion of infrastructure sabotage. Suspicions were that these ships were not only transporting oil, but were also being used in sabotage operations targeting the Baltic Connector natural gas pipeline between Finland and Estonia and undersea data cables in the region. An incident in October 2024 in which a Chinese ship damaged a pipeline with its propeller, further reinforced reinforced these suspicions. Countries such as Estonia and Finland had also repeatedly warned about uninsured and unidentified tankers approaching their territorial waters in a dangerous manner. The final straw was a brazen threat directly targeting civilian security and the Boracay case, which exposed the entire plot. On September 28, 2025, the Danish Defence Intelligence Service, FE, exposed the entire plot in an intelligence report sent to its allies with the code URGENT. The report contained shocking evidence that Russia was using civilian tankers belonging to its shadow fleet as launch platforms for kamikaze drone attacks on targets in Europe. Acting on this intelligence bombshell, the French Navy launched a breathtaking helicopter operation on the tanker Boracay, sailing in the Bay of Biscay on the morning of September 30th. According to an official statement released by the French Ministry of Defense and confirmed by international news agencies Reuters and Associated Press, a search of the ship's cargo hold revealed at least 6 explosive-laden kamikaze UAV launchers hidden inside special containers tucked between oil tanks. This was irrefutable, concrete evidence that Russia had used a civilian ship for a military attack against a NATO country. The issue was no longer just the damage rusty ships could cause to the environment. The issue was the enormous national security threat posed by hundreds of potential UAV ships sailing in the Baltic Sea and along European coasts. This chain of evidence, these accumulated provocations, and this final brazen move were the ultimate trigger that spurred Denmark into action, transforming that 50-year-old environmental law into a national security weapon. Here, Denmark is putting the 1974 Helsinki Convention, HELCOM, and international maritime law on the table, rather than imposing a military blockade, which would be a cause for war. The new legal framework grants Danish authorities the power to stop, inspect, and block the passage of uninsured, old and poorly maintained tankers identified as belonging to the Shadow Fleet. The operation will proceed as follows. A vessel belonging to the Danish Navy or Coast Guard will approach a suspicious tanker and request an inspection. Inspectors boarding the vessel will check its compliance with international maritime standards, namely the SOLAS, Safety of Life at Sea, and MARPOL, Marine Pollution Prevention Conventions. It is known that almost all Shadow Fleet vessels do not meet these standards. If it is determined that insurance policies are fake or insufficient, emergency equipment is not working, personnel are inadequate, or the structural integrity of the vessel is at risk, the vessel will be labeled unfit for passage and will not be allowed to proceed. Following the Boracay case, these inspections will now also include checking for suspicious military modifications or illegal cargo on board. This is not an actual seizure or military intervention. It is a completely legitimate, internationally legal, and unavoidable bureaucratic strangulation operation. Russia's objection to this inspection amounts to an admission that its own ships are rotten and dangerous. This is a flawless legal checkmate that strikes Putin with his own lies. The shockwaves triggered by Denmark's legal move instantly and devastatingly reached the heart of Russia's already critical economy and domestic front. This is not a future threat, but a catalyst that transforms a series of crises Russia is already in into an avalanche disaster. To understand the devastating impact of this move, we first need to look at Russia's situation prior to Denmark's decision. The country was in the grip of its deepest and most dangerous fuel crisis since the start of the war. Throughout 2024 and 2025, Ukraine systematically struck dozens of refineries, the heart of Russia's oil industry, with long-range kamikaze drones such as the Liutyi. Massive fires at facilities in Ryazan, Tuapse, Volgograd, and Novoshakhtinsk literally crippled Russia's gasoline and diesel production capacity. According to Reuters analysis, these attacks caused Russia's refined petroleum product output to drop by more than 15%. The crisis grew so severe that Russia, one of the world's largest oil producers, was forced to completely ban gasoline exports for 6 months starting in March 2025 to meet its own domestic demand. But even this failed to stem the bleeding. Kilometers-long queues formed at gas stations in regions like Krasnodar, Samara, and Novosibirsk. Farmers couldn't find diesel for harvesting, and mass panic began among the local population. This was the moment when the cost of the war spilled out from the glittering streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg and hit the daily lives of ordinary Russian citizens. Denmark's move is equivalent to pouring a barrel of gasoline on this burning fire. When the export tap in the Baltic closes, it doesn't just mean billions of dollars in lost revenue, it creates a far more devastating domino effect. Crude oil extracted from Russia's western oil fields and pumped through pipelines to the ports of Primorsk and Ust-Luga can no longer be loaded onto tankers. Storage facilities at these ports will reach full capacity within days. When that happens, pipeline flows will have to be halted. This means production at Siberian oil wells must physically stop. Shutting down and restarting an oil well is a technically extremely difficult and costly process. This means that Russia's entire oil production chain will come to a halt, like vehicles in a traffic accident colliding with each other. This logistical paralysis will completely exhaust the already scarce supply of gasoline and diesel in the domestic market. The fuel needed for the army's tanks and trucks at the front will have to compete with the fuel needed for civilian cars and farmers' tractors. This is not just an economic crisis, it is the risk of the state failing to perform its most basic functions, the collapse of social order and total chaos. Denmark's move cuts off the artery to Russia's economic heart while also destroying the nervous system that keeps the home front functioning. The strategic genius of Denmark's move lies in leaving Putin in a position where he cannot respond militarily, in a state of complete diplomatic helplessness. The Boracay case transformed Denmark's action into a legitimate national security measure, fully compliant with international law. How could Putin respond militarily to this situation? Would he open fire on a Danish inspection vessel? The moment he did so, he would trigger Article 5 of NATO and instantly find himself in a full-scale war with 32 countries and the fighter jets of the USS Gerald R. Ford, waiting for orders on the high seas. So, is firing the nuclear-capable Iskander missiles in Kaliningrad or the Bastion anti-ship coastal defense systems an option? Against whom? There is no military target, only civilian inspectors enforcing international law. So, in the face of this legitimate and legally brilliant move, Russia's counter-move options are gone. Although the Kremlin's propaganda channels sell this as a blockade, the world knows it is a result of Russia's own recklessness. This legal trap is so cleverly constructed that it completely neutralizes Russia's military power. The second and longer-term move in this strategic checkmate is the destruction of the tacit social contract that forms the basis of the Putin regime. This contract was simple. Give me your political freedoms, and I will give you stability, national pride, and economic prosperity. Oil revenues were the cement of this contract. Now that these revenues have evaporated and the domestic fuel crisis has turned into a social collapse, this contract is being torn up before the eyes of millions of Russian citizens. When heating systems stop, when salaries cannot be paid, when fights break out at gas stations, Putin has nothing left to offer. This is not just an economic collapse, but a fundamental undermining of the regime's legitimacy and the preparation of the most fertile ground for a potential internal mutiny. The global impact of this event is the ultimate proof of how isolated Russia is and how sophisticated the tools the West can now employ have become. Ultimately, rather than defeating Russia militarily on the battlefield, the West seems to have found the ultimate formula to make it economically unviable, suffocating it within its own system. What is happening in the Baltic Sea is not simple environmental control, but the most sophisticated and ruthless economic countermeasure of the 21st century, given to Russia's audacity to turn civilian ships into weapons against NATO. The Russian bear, first blinded militarily in Ukraine and then strangled logistically behind the front lines, now has its economic heart stopped. This legitimate step taken by Denmark following the Boracay plot could be the spark that ignites the beginning of the end of the war, illuminating the path to the Kremlin's collapse. Vladimir Putin lost this war, which he could not win with missiles and armies, to an anonymous bureaucrat holding a folder in Copenhagen. Thank you for choosing us.